I am so excited to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Evan Pritchard, who's here, putting the pieces together, Native Americans in Northern Westchester. When we look at Northern Westchester, we see the shattered pieces of a once vibrant Native American network. Evan will help give us a better understanding of Native American life here. Evan is a descendant of the Mi'kmaq people, part of the Algonquin Nations. He is the founder of the Center for Algonquin Culture and is a former professor of Native American history at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. He's the author of Native New Yorkers, The Legacy of the Algonquin People of New York. He's also the author of the widely praised No Word for Time, The Way of the Algonquin People, and many other books, as you will see over on the table, that will be available for purchase after the lecture. Professor Pritchard has given Native New Yorker walking tours of Lower Manhattan for the Smithsonian Institute and many other institutions. His extensive research serves to pull together parts of the history of our area that have not been widely shared. We're really excited to host him here tonight. He's been incredibly supportive of the work that we've been doing in Chappaqua to understand the history of the Native Americans who lived here and the recent discovery of a Native American sacred site at Buttonhook Forest in the Valley Ridge section of Chappaqua. He will be sharing maps, he has shared maps with us of canoe routes and portages, which we'll hear more about tonight. And we certainly look forward to hearing so much more from him, and we're thrilled that he could be here. You'll have the opportunity for questions after the presentation, and I look forward to turning it over to you.
So that was the scholarly getting it.
The antenna's rubbing against your shirt.
Sound check.
Okay. I feel like, okay, that's better, right? Those battery-operated toys, you know, it's got wires all over them. Okay, so anyway, in terms of understanding a culture, you can read a lot about this and that, but to really get the feel for it, you need some music. So I thought I'd do a welcome song and then play some flute to get us started, okay? So here's the welcome song. And, if you're coming in to wherever, up the sawmill or whatever, and I'm welcoming you to the land, I've sing you a song and you could sing back the verses. So let's try that. We start, the first one would be for the South. We go, you-a-hi-ya, hey, you-a-hi-ya, and then you sing back, you-a-hi-ya, hey, you-a-hi-ya, you-a-hi-ya, hey, you-a-hi-ya. Okay, then it gets harder. Way-hi-ya, hey, yo-yo, way-hi-ya, hey, yo, way-hi-ya, hey, yo-yo, way-hi-ya, hey, yo. You way high, oh way. You way high, oh way. Okay, then we turn clockwise from the south to the west. And south is the direction of air and of the birds. And the west is the direction of water. You way high, hey, you way high. You way high, hey, you way high. Here comes the heart. Way high, hey, yo, yo, way high, hey, yo. Hey, yo, way high. You way high, oh, way. You way high, oh, way. And then we turn to the, where were we? The north. You way high, hey, you way high. You way high, hey, you way high. Oh, way high, hey, yo, yo, way high, hey, yo. Way high, hey, yo, yo, way high, hey. You way high, yo, way. You way high, oh, way. Very good chorus. And now we'll go turning to the east in our minds, and we'll sing to the east, to the direction of the sun and to Great Spirit. And we'll modulate to F sharp. You a hi ya, hey, you a hi ya. Hey, you a hi ya, hey, you a hi ya. Oh, a hi ya, hey, yo, yo, a hi ya, hey, yo. Hey, yo, yo, a hi ya, hey. Hey, you a hi, way, hi, yo, way. You a hi, way, hi, oh. All right, so you got the part. Thank you. Very good. So now you feel a little bit energetic, a little bit that native spirit of gathering and making music. And I have the second part of that is, I'm sure you all, drove like heck to get here on time and all this rest of the highway. And so we got to just separate ourselves from that. And the best way we would do that is a kind of a single pointed meditation. And that is, I play the flute for you. You close your eyes and just follow this flute and don't think about anything else. Okay, just the flute. And then all of those other thoughts will go away. We talk about Loué Wudi and the Micmac people, my people, and there's means bad things in my heart, and the bad things are in order. There's there's confusion is first. Come in, hey, how you doing? Follow Mitchell. Confusion is first, and then from that, if you don't take care of that, there's fear, and then anger, and then hatred. And so you want to stop it right away by keeping mindful and being calm. And then the different parts of your brain will work together in concert. So if you want to just close your eyes for a moment, I'm just going to play. And a group asked me, well, what is it called? What's the piece called? It's improvised. I never know what it's going to be. Okay, so close your eyes. Okay, so enjoy that moment of peace and open your eyes. And now your brains are all fully loaded and empty like the flute, right? Though it won't be empty for long. So I want to talk about the Wappingers people. And that's, Tracy asked me just, a while ago, and also yesterday, that's we really focused on the Wappingers. People have lots of questions about the Wappingers. And I had forgotten that's what I was going to talk about, so I kind of put more Wappingers in there. And so I just wanted to present this PowerPoint, but go off from that and see what happens. So this is acknowledging the indigenous people, the Westchester, of course, that was due. Been doing acknowledgements for 30 years, and part of the reason is because that's what Native people do. Whenever you gather, you're supposed to do an acknowledgement of the people who have been there in early times, so going way back before, I'll say, Henry Hudson. And in this case, the Wappingers people as a whole, of this whole area. And they have a unique kind of history in that they've never been federally or state recognized, and most of them would not want to be. And they're very, very humble people. And one of the things that people have commented is that they subsume the first person in their speech. And I thought, well, that must be maybe possible in Wappingers, and I have studied a little bit, but it'd be really hard to do in English. But then I've met many Wappingers people, and they can do it in English, and it's you have to kind of play the tape. Well, how do they do that? It's almost impossible, right? To have no I, or George Harrison said, I, me, mine. That that series of words in Wappingers is maybe a little impolite, to go too hard on the I, me, mine. And you're always possessive, like you can say we, right? That's okay. But it's amazingly humble culture, and they like to kind of keep out of, a lot of them try to keep out of the limelight. So I'm going to talk about Wappingers cultures a bit, but mainly the call was to establish the geography of the Wappingers, because there are other opinions, and the fact that they're not state or federally recognized, people say, well, did they ever exist? Well, sure. Amazing people, unique, and not necessarily like even the surrounding peoples. They were very inclusive and brought others into the community. So I'm going to share some ideas as we go. So we're acknowledging the Wappingers today, and specifically, of course, Chappaqua was one of the nations of our sacgemdoms, if we'll use it correctly, of the Wappingers, and we won't necessarily even Commonwealth. Commonwealth would fit, okay? Maybe Confederacy is a little too organized, because they don't all stem from one source and one person necessarily. They have gathered into what they became. And so they were inclusive, and it's sort of like the United States. I think the Wappingers are a precursor of the U.S. So I'm going to tell this little story, a little story, when coyote ate turtle. Can you see all that? Can you see any of it? In certain traditional Native American stories, coyote eats turtle. And then the waters of the earth dry up, and the people, the animals and the plants, all ask coyote to do something. So he coughs up the turtle again. But it's too late. She is in pieces. As you see, the turtle is broken up, and the shell on the back of the turtle is broken into 13 pieces. Oops, well, how'd that happen? Well, coyote chewed it up. Okay. The animals have to piece turtles together again, which is still existent today. You can see it today in the lines on the turtle's back, and now restored to life. When we look at the northern Westchester area today, we are seeing a similar sight, and that the shattered pieces of a once vibrant network of thriving Wappingers communities, part of the Algonquin world, have there but shattered. Today we will attempt to put some of the pieces back together using the medicine wheel teachings as a guide for research. And I mean that in the most abstract way. The 4 directions would be colonial records, oral tradition, including, which would be trail making, for example, is a part of an oral tradition that we know about. Also settlement practices. There are customs for settling on the land and fitting into the land and using it wisely. So 3 is linguistics and translations regarding place names and geographical terms. And archaeology, certain aspects of archaeology Native Americans have long been familiar with, including what's on the surface. Okay. So then the land will magically become vibrant again, restoring our spiritual relationship to the land. And so that's, just as an introduction. I mentioned Algonquins, and this is, every aspect of this topic is, a subject of debate by somebody, but some of it is unnecessary debate. For example, the word Algonquin is the main word in America, the United States of America, for this group of people, who's the largest, oldest group of Native Americans. But people argue about what does Algonquin mean? Is it one of the native words, or is it a French interpretation? Well, our word is Kichi-Atukwogan, and that's the people who wear the skin of the white-tailed deer. And there's a little story about that. And you see the map on the left, all the way to the left, is Algonquin-speaking territories, color-coded as they were at contact, and have been for several thousand years. And you also see that Illinois, Wisconsin, and Minnesota would be included in the map, but not shown in this particular slide. And the map on the right, which is now in the center of the screen, you see that it's green and purple. The green part, that green part is the habitat of the northern boreal white-tailed deer, and the word for it is atuk. So you see Kichi-Atukwogan means that we identify with the northern boreal white-tailed deer, which is Algonquin, is easy to say, atuk. It matches the Proto-Algonquin territory about 1700, and that's when the Arapaho and the Cheyenne left to go west to the Great Lakes. So you see, hopefully you see these two maps are very similar. Okay, that the colored area of the linguistics, and that's color-coded according to dialects. I created that map, but in the middle, that same green area is for the deer. So we have the same migratory territory to identify with. Now let's start with, I'm going to talk a lot about travel by water, because we have various portages around Chappaqua, which have probably not been used a lot, but maybe a few times. But if you go way back, thousands of years, the muhul, which is a tulip tree canoe, was the main type of water transportation on the Bronx River, on the Hudson River. It lasts for years and resists salt water. By the way, there's one over at Dobbs Ferry which has survived. It turns out the Dobbs family took it from the Native Americans and started making money on it. No judgment, right? One problem, it's too heavy to carry, even a few feet. It weighs a ton. It would be like taking your Volkswagen and saying, I'll just put it over here, but nobody does that because it's too heavy. So you had to stay in your watershed, which is sort of like staying in your lane. But anyway, so that was a limitation of sorts. So they pretty much had to stay with this kind of boat in the Hudson and the main waterways. But then somebody, an Algonquin person, according to texts that I read and researched, invented the birch bark canoe in the upper Ottawa River about 7,000 years ago. This is mentioned in Since Time Immemorial. It was a great book, 1617. You can only get it in Canada, but can't help that. Suddenly, boat could be carried from one watershed to the other, opening up vast trade areas for small teams of canoers. And again, this area is prime for portaging, and still is. And it's a fossil fuel-free way of transportation. So I'm trying to inspire everyone. I go around all the Westchester saying, come on, we could do this. You know, it only takes a few little bills and passing legislature and all, and we could do this. We could have public transportation without fuel. And so this is the idea. But anyway, there are a few suitable birches today, however, but my compatriot Mi'kmaq Todd Labrador, who's a student of William Commander, who's my adopted grandfather, builds canoes like this one every year. So it's in the picture. So these are carryable by 2 or 3 people. I mean, they're not light. And sometimes the portages are long, but you know, it's like, I want to impress you with the portages. It's not, like you don't complain. It's just like, you got to do what you got to do. And if you're traveling around Westchester on a public bus, you sometimes might end up temporarily where you don't want to go so that you can go where you do want to go, right? Because it's efficient in a different way. So that's the same thing with here, you'll see. So here's a famous painting of a portage in Chicago where it's opened up the west because 10 days out of the year, the Chicago River meets the Michigan River and they all flow together, and so people can just travel. But otherwise, you carry. And the portage route was then called Route 66, by the way, which is a lovely song. And the Stones did something with it, I don't know. Okay, so talking about this amazing culture, well, Algonquin culture, you want to know something about it because you're in Algonquin territory. So about 4,000 to 5,000 BC, they had a copper culture that was much more advanced than the Egyptians. And I think there's a gesture like this. But they had tin. But 1,000 years later, the Egyptians caught up, and then they found tin, and they could do bronze and all that. We didn't have any tin. The closest tin was in El Paso, and we didn't get there. So this is a map of the major trade routes, according to my research, of course, in this golden rectangle, which is the Nipissing area. And there's the Mattawa River and the Ottawa River, all kind of coming together and creating this gigantic trade center. And some of these routes require portage. So all these things came together. And the copper, you see up in the Lake Superior in the upper left, when archaeologists I don't think they hired archaeologists, they should have, but when they're digging the hole for the Brooklyn Bridge to build that big stanchion, they found copper, and they could identify it as being from Lake Superior. And this whole network still exists. It's existed for a long time. So Oconto was a big copper center in 4000 BC, and up in the upper left, Copper Harbor, that's still considered a hotspot. Isle Royal, hotspot. I have been there, and I've seen these large green rocks right at the waterside. And somebody said, you know what that green rock is? I said, no, it's a green rock. I said, that's raw copper. Anyway, I'm not going to read all of these writings, but the film, those people are watching the film, they can stop the film and they can read all this, because we have more material than we can go over. So how did it get here? How did those customs of portaging go all the way from up there to down here? Well, there was a wonderful portage in Ticonderoga where you could come down Lake Champlain and then go over La Chute through Montcalm Road and into Lake George, and and you're in. Say so, and then on the left side you see Lake George, and there's a river. There's a portage. The red line on the left, that's a portage route connecting it to the Hudson River and therefore to here. Okay, so this is how it all works together, and how we end up having these traditions here. Now, this is one of my favorite. It wasn't long before the portage method reached the Hudson Valley, of course, and for thousands more years, the Bronx River connected canoers to portage routes and other rivers. And one of the most important was the portage at Coropus. You know, Coropus is White Plains. And it, it really means a field that shines white in the golden sunlight of morning. But the British said, no, we'll just call it White Plains. And that's called their improvement program. But by the way, I found a recent document saying that when the colonists came, and until recent times, in the middle of White Plains, there was a mortar and pestle with that corn had been ground, and monuments to past Coropus people right there. And so the writer in like 1800 was complaining about how run down it was and how old it looked. We got to get rid of this old thing. I was like, no, but it's too late. It's gone. But here is White Plains as it was when it was Coropus. Coropus in the lower left is a village, and Main Street was a trail, Hamilton Avenue and Lake 22 is the old post road, also called the Tulpehoken Trail, covers the back of Turtle Island, and it connects the Bronx River, or Aquahung, and all the way over to the Mamaroneck River, and then it goes up to Silver Lake and on. So there's this wonderful portage there, which is now Main Street in in White Plains. And what's beautiful, we're not going to have time to go through all the different place names, but they're beautiful. Some of them are so poetic, like even Coropus, But it also implies there's marshy, not just as these whatever grass is shining in the dawn sunlight, but there's also water. And Packeteswaki is one of my favorite. I mean, it sounds almost like something sacred, like how we say namaste, It's like namaste, well, Packeteswati, and you. But it means the flat place where the beautiful river flows through the flat land where the beautiful river flows through. Brings tears to your eyes. And now it's, Mamaroneck is also an Algonquin word. And this is the big picture. And again, people on film can study this. It's quite a lot here, but just to give you a quick idea, is that the orange part is Dobbs Ferry area, which was called Westchester, and that's where they moved people. There was a deal done where the Mohawks were going to come through to get their wampum beads from the 3 wampum stations on the coast, and so they opened up Coropus for all these Mohawk traders coming through this back channel, through the Bronx River, and through all these various tributaries, which you could easily portage to, as you see this yellow road, which is, that's the portage route, is, I forget. But I know it well. But that orange route cuts across all of these different rivers. And I thought, people could portage through any one of these. And there's actually 8 rivers in the area, all of which actually go to different places. It's really remarkable. And on the left here, we have the Sawmill, which comes right by here. So you could be in this area and go across from the Bronx River here and go up north on the Sawmill. And the Sawmill is very placid, and you can go either way. So it all is connected. The left side is the Wayqueesgeek territory, and the right side, the green, is Siwanoy, 2 different Wappingers confederacies. So I want to show you this. This is one of my main maps here, because this is the old map before all the reservoirs. So you see in the upper left, there's the Croton River, which was called Kitchewan, or the Great Tributary, arcing around and coming to the right, up to the top, connecting with the Wampus River, and then coming down. There's a portage. You see the portage, the red line? And this is near us, and connecting to more rivers down to, connecting with the Bronx River. And there's Coropus connecting to the Mamaroneck. And that goes to the Lapawaking wampum factory through the Hutchinson River. So I'll cut this short because we have a lot to do, but you see how this is a back route, back door for the Mohawks. You see, well, okay, so what's the importance? Well, the Mohawks had to have wampum because their political system was based on it, and their historical records were based on making wampum belts that told the story. And so their constitution, in a sense, has been said, the Great Law, there's a belt that records the Great Law. And that, you can ask anybody, is like basically, they say that was the first draft of the US Constitution. And that's true. And the Algonquins wrote the Bill of Rights, just to make it really short. But this is an actual route that they used to bring the wampum in its raw form to and from the Mohawk River. And then they would weave them into historical belts. And you think about that, how important that was, because if they couldn't get to the wampum, if they didn't have any, they had a different kind of shell, and it just didn't make good wampum, but a gray shell. But the colored shells were from our area here and from Long Island, and they had to get those shells. And going way out into the Atlantic was very risky because of the weather and other things, so they had to have this. And if they didn't, where would the United States be without its Constitution? Well, probably the same. Anyway, okay, now one of the most important points, and this is I think, a really amazing map. I'm going to show you that this is very unusual in that these watershed ridges divide the different watersheds, and the green dotted lines are the ridges. And generally there's only one on this side and one on that side, and the river flows in the middle. That's a watershed. But here is very unusual. You have up in the upper left, you have this Seasqua, or Kisco is really Seasqua, and somebody put CIS, sort of Seasqua, mean muddy, but people pronounced it Kisco because they thought the C was a K. And then people wrote down the K to make sure they got it right, and they got it wrong. So the Seasqua River is over here where the arrow is, and the Kitchewan is above that. And so then you have this green dotted line with Seasqua on one side and Kitona on the other side. You see that? So that's a watershed ridge dividing the two watersheds there. But then you go down and you see the Kitchewan watershed, and then that ridge, and then below that is the Bronx River watershed, and then to the right is the Mayanas watershed. So you have four watersheds meeting in a single point because the two ridges cross, and I've never seen that before. But it means that if you live in Mount Kisco, 1400 AD, you can go anywhere. Just got to lug your canoe over the ridge. And that's part of what made this area so important to travel, and for any kind of travel, but especially for the wampum trade. Okay, so this is the big picture, and I'm sorry this is so small, but it's such a large area that this particular partage complex covers. You see, you have the Kitchewan all over in the upper left, and coming across, that's the Croton River now, and it goes through. You see that golden shape there at the very top? That's Chappaqua. Okay, and it was an independent sachendom of the Wappingers Confederacy. And it was unique in that the people were very independent. They never signed their land away. They never signed anything. They always had to have somebody come in to sign, and they remained aloof and independent. And Chappaqua means a separate place, and that's why it means a separate place. There could be layers of meaning. And I would say, if it doesn't have at least two layers of meaning, it's not Algonquin. That's my motto. So Chappaqua, as far as I'm concerned, is mainly, it's a separate place because all around it was all these nations of the Wappingers Confederacy or Commonwealth, and they were part of it, and yet they didn't really participate. They just kind of watched, and the chief was Wampus, Chief Wampus, and Wampus Pond. And so off the record, you know, just what is said here stays here, but there was this amazing story about Chief Wampus that he had this wife. I don't think it's a really true story, but and she was eavesdropping on his secret meeting, and he was so angry he turned into a cat. He only got halfway before she ran away, so she'd run off half cat, half woman. Okay, and you can see paintings of her online if you really want to know. But that story traveled all the way out to Oklahoma and, you know, and to Arkansas, and it's just a fun story, you know. But I'm sure it's disrespectful to women because whatever. But it's the story. But here you see up across the top, you have 8 Mile River. If you connect to that, you go out to here to Darien, Connecticut. If you go down the Wampus River and take the Bronx River and take that little red line that's in the middle of the map, that gets you into the Hutchinson River. And then if you don't take that exit and you go to the next exit and that little red line, and that connects you to the Merrimack, and so forth and so on. And then if you stay on the Bronx River and don't get off any of the exits, and again, these don't look like exits, but they are, you get all the way to Snackapins, which is Classen's Point, which was the big one. That was a big, like the Fort Knox, by the way, because they had to make these things, and it took time. So that's a little history lesson. And of course, again, like I was saying, this is very, you know, it's evident to me that they must have been doing this, but think of the importance to the whole local economy. So I took some real maps, some modern maps, and see how it would be to drive or to route today, and along this backdoor route. And so you see on the left, you see that the water is flowing out to the Hudson, of course. So you're going upstream, but it's so calm, it doesn't really, it's not going to be in your way. So you're just rowing upstream, and then you kind of lean to the outside of the current. But anyway, you'd go upstream all along this blue line, along what's now the Croton River, and again, it's very different. But then you get to Newcastle, which again is like almost a wannabe Chappaqua, and you take a right turn down the Kisco River, and it takes you quite far into the interior. And then if you go also Kisco River, this is the next map down on the right, see it now stops in Newcastle. But then I want to show you, this is the Sawmill River coming up in the center of the map, and then you have Chappaqua. Can you see Chappaqua in the lower center? And then there's this very small, that red line in the middle, that's a portage, and it connects to the Chappaqua Creek, which is the one that's kind of a right angle, and then it goes further up and connects. And there's also this one, which used to be large. This is Wampus Creek, and you know, I think development has really killed it. But again, Wampus was named after his pond. Wampus, Wan is a tributary, and Pus is small. P is drinking water, and Us is small. So it's a small pond where you can drink the water. And most of the Algonquin place names have a level that means something about the food you can get there. So why travel with water? Isn't that restricted? Well, in fact, in those days, everybody you knew would have lived on the water. So you could go and just meet anybody. And there's a story about a Montauk woman, also related, and her sons. This is in the 1800s, and the sons, maybe 1900s, the sons wanted to do a present for her. So they built her a brick house because she was living in a wigwam and all that. So they built her this brick house that was right on the water, but there was a road, and they built the front door so people could drive up. And they left her alone for a while and said, well, she must really like that house. She's been staying in there, and haven't heard from her. And so they went over, and it turned out she was knocking out the back wall. This big, all by herself, you know, 80-year-old lady was knocking out the brick wall. And said, what are you doing? He says, well, the entrance has to be in the east, and it has to face the water, so my canoe can come up. So you see, everybody would have been on the water. Those are, each wigwam represents a village. You see that? That's northern Westchester, which is, we're in there somewhere. And then this is southern Westchester. And that, you see that line is White Plains Road. And Ashford Avenue is even more in the center. So each wigwam represents a village. So there's lots of people you can visit, and they're all in rivers. Now, this is one of my favorites. This is, I distributed this at Lewisboro last year, and it's a lot to it. You see, right in the, I see, whatever you call that, the horse neck and the little crotch there, that is Cross Pond, where it says Toquam. And what's interesting is that you have 4 different sachendoms or nations that meet there, their territories meet, and there's a council rock that still stands there. And they used to come, and they could all go to the same council rock without crossing into other people's territories. It's so ingenious. And so you see the Kitchewang in blue, and their territory coming down, and then on the east clockwise you have Connecticut people, Kandatoa, kind of related to the Paugussets, they're probably there now, and the Tenkatagis in purple are the next one around, and again, they all meet, their territories meet, and then the Siwanoi are the gold below, and again, all their territories meet. And the Wesqueesgeeks are also nearby, and they're related to the Tagis. The Sinsink are next to the Chappaqua, and the Chappaqua are there too. You see right on the left. Chappaqua were part of this group, but they were, again, just a little bit off from the center. They like to stay by themselves. But most of the, each of these nations is part of important confederacies within the Wappingers Confederacy. So it was an ideal situation. So a little complicated, but amazing at the same time. The Toquams are part of the Siwanoi here too. So, and the Rippawams you see below, they had like a very elaborate, a well-constructed form of government. So one of the things I started writing books about natives is I felt that a lot of what you read is stereotypes and untrue. Like, would say, well, they were just wandering around, savages wandering around, grabbing for grubs and walking blindly through the forest and not being able to talk to each other because their language was just gibberish. You read, you know, that's the stuff that people have been writing, so it's actually not true. Is that obviously they had a sophisticated government. So I like showing this, the 4 tribes of Lewisboro. Now, here's the main part, and this is having to do with your handout. And I guess I want to summarize because there's a lot of information on that, but the idea is that I took this author, Bolton, who wrote around the turn of the century, and see what he said about these various sachendoms or nations of this Wappingers Confederacy or Commonwealth, and to see if he said they were Wappingers. Okay, in case you were wondering, are they really Wappingers? And people will say other things. But no book on the native history of New York should be taken as gospel. But one book that is, I say, served me well is R.P. Bolton's New York City in Indian Possession, and Smithsonian, 1920. Now, Bolton visited each site in person, discussed the archaeology and the colonial documents with colleagues. And one must remember that most of these colleagues were white men. Okay, so let's, I have to say that. Okay, but what's important is the merits of his studies. And I question each entry. However, over 30 years, I find the merits are in pretty good shape. Overall, most of what he says at least makes sense. And I can compare it now with dozens of other sources and say if it's even 80% accurate, that's a lot better than most of the things I've read out there. So let's put together the pieces of Bolton's writings about our local colonial records to see what he says about these Wappingers' claims to territories along the east bank of the Hudson. And so then remember, as you're reading, that Wappingers has an R phoneme. You might say letter, but it's the sound. They didn't have letters. Whereas Munsee has L and no R, and Classical Mohican has neither L nor R. It's a non-rhotic language, and there are many of them around the world. Some place names only make sense in Wappingers, but not Munsee. The problem is the arguments can be tedious, and I spare you. Okay, let's talk with Siwanoi, and he writes, this chieftaincy covered, in other words, he means consisted of, one of the largest tracts of the Wappingers. So it's Wappingers, according to him. Their actual occupancy was confined between 5 Mile River on the east and the Bronx River on the west. Their interior holdings ran indefinitely 18 miles northward from Stanford, bringing them into the Kitchewang area and the Wesqueesgeeks. He mentions Underhill's massacre of 500 to 700 of a tribe of Siwanoi on 1644. Now, I happen to know it's February 25th because the full moon, that was when the full moon was that year. It was the first anniversary of his massacre of the Tappan at Pravonia, following on his massacre at Mystic. He was a very busy man. That's Underhill, and there's still relatives of him living around here, so I just don't want to say too much. In the piece that followed, the Wappings of Stanford were represented by sachems of other chieftaincies. As you use the Wappings, you see, it's the same, really the same word, and it suggests that the sachems had been killed. It also suggests the word Wapping can be used interchangeably with Wappingers. Also, that the Rippewam of Stanford must have also been Wappingers. And now there's Chief Ponus, by the way, a famous celebrity. He sold the area in 1640 on behalf of both the Rippewam and the Toquam. So if the Rippewam were Wappingers, so were the Toquam. Toquam means a round rock, and some people have told me they think that means a rock that looks like a turtle. That's apocryphal, okay? And the initial R in Rippewam and Roatan is a strong clue. They spoke Wappingers because of Munsey couldn't say that. So the thing about, well, I can go back to that later, but it's very interesting about there were battles between the Rippewam and the Toquam, and they're both Wappingers nations. And I don't know any other cases where the Wappingers are really fighting each other. They fought, Manhattans. They fought Munsey once they won, but then fighting each other doesn't sound likely. Except that I believe that is the case, and I think that the early colonists helped engineer these fights. Otherwise, so what happened was brilliant, always brilliant, because there's this way of the Heron political system of peacemaking. And what Chief Ponus did was he became chief of both the warring tribes and made peace because he was the boss. It's smart. Okay, Roatan. The easterly tract was Roatan, so it would be eastern part of Stanford, covering the space between 5 Mile River and Norriton River. And the nation is often left out of this Wappingers list, but Bolton suggests it was Wappingers. Now, Shonaroke was chief of the Siwanoy, and he was succeeded by Patunk in 1660, and he sold White Plains, Rye, Merrimack River, Harrison, North Castle, Newcastle, West Farms, Scarsdale, Rye Pond, New Rochelle, and Pelham were also Siwanoy localities. So Siwanoy was very large. And what we're hearing about is the sale of the land, but that's because we're looking at a very large span of time from a very far away position. So it looks like that's all they did, but that's what we have legal records of. The territory of the Siwanoy from 5 Miles River to Hunts Point in the west and along the shoreline, bounded west by the Bronx River and as far as the Croton River, very, very large area, as I showed you in the other map. Bolton says they're friendly neighbors with the Kitchewan and the Wayqueesgeek. So were they Wappingers? Well, according to Ruttenberg, they were. A small brook of the Rectuanic was included in the sale, one of which was Takaroo Fordham. So in other words, they were doing business with the Manhattan people. Okay, so the Wayqueesgeek, the extent of the Wayqueesgeek territory, the present township of Yonkers, Greenburg, and Mount Pleasant, and including Dobbs Ferry, their principal station, was situated, and Alapconk at Terrytown. Now, Alapconk, by the way, means hills covered with oaks, and there actually is such a place even today that has been preserved, where they looked there and they studied that area, because that must have been where Alapconk was, and they found huge shell middens under the ground, which showed evidence of thousands of years of occupation. So that seems to be true. And bounded by the Bocantico in the west and touching the Sint-Sink, or as you know, Ossining, and those hilly woodlands of Chief Wampus. He keeps coming us, and he's our Chappaqua guy. The Wayqueesgeeks were most aggressive of the chieftaincies on the eastern side of the Hudson. Their geographic position, now listen carefully between the lines, may have contributed to their dominance since the territory afforded easy access to most of the other members of the Wappinger Confederacy. That's his words, Wappingers Confederacy. And what is this easy access? Well, I believe it's the canoe routes, not just the Hudson, but they had access to all the nations through all these portage routes. And the mouth of the Neppara, which is Nepperham, which is the Sawmill River. You ever wondered about Nepperham Avenue in Yonkers? Oh boy, you thought it was English. It's not English. That's one of our words. There's a great rock called Sigkis, or Megaskitsau, and to this place the natives of other tribes came for conference and discussion. And there was a big one in 1660 where natives come from all over, including Iroquois and Haudenosaunee speakers came to meet. So the Wecqueesgeek were a very big deal in terms of the region and government. So then we find Westchester, the sachem of the Wecqueesgeeks, taking part in sales in Ossining in 1688. He says some may have taken refuge in North Cortland or fled with their neighbors, the Rekawawant, to the mountain fastness of the Tappan. Well, I wrote a book about that called The Tappan, the Keepers of the River Crossings. But then the Tappan were in turn absorbed as refugees by the Ramapo. So some of the descendants of here are living in the Ramapo Mountains with the Ramapo people. So we can be pretty sure of that. In 1649, Pennakeek said the Raritanus were formerly at Wecqueesgeek, in other words, around Yonkers. And the Raritanus, of course, the Raritan River, which means like a good tributary. But notice that the Wecquaesgeek people can be found today, west of Newark, New Jersey. These people, there's a Westquaesgeek Park. If you want to go to Newark, if you have nothing better to do, you go to Newark. And just west of it was all this Wecquaesgeek Park, Wecquaesgeek Library, Wecquaesgeek School. It's all there. And the people, a lot of them are Westquaesgeek. They don't want you to know that. Okay, so the Kitchewan. On the Hudson from Senasqua as far as Sackhouse and Peekskill, the same thing. Their territory extended eastward into Connecticut. So all that, the Kitchewan River goes all the way across the county into Connecticut. So they were all along that river. They were named after the river Kitchewan, which means great tributary, which could be Muncie or Wappingers. The sachem co-signed for White Plains. He believed that Pat Hunk was Grand Sachem of the Siwanoy, retired to live with the Kitchewans. And again, they have those ties. And I have no doubt that the Kitchewan were Wappingers. And again, another writer writing in 1882 wrote that they were Wappingers. Now it's the Sinsinks on the Hudson, North Tarrytown, Briarcliff Manor, Ossining to the mouth of the Croton River. One land sale signed by Chief Wampus, he's our guy, the Chappaqua, Newcastle District. Kitchewan, not included in the Wampus sale of Chappaqua and jointly with Pathunk of Siwanoy. Bolton does not say they were Wappingers, but elsewhere. And much land was sold in 1689 by this Chief Wampus. And so somewhere I have the list of the towns. Roaring Brook, you know where that is? It's right down the street. That was the village site. We'll get to that. But the Sinsink, if you know Ossining train station, and there's that creek that comes out to the Hudson, and there's all those small potatoes, right? All those little stones that are around. That's Ossining. It's a place of small stones. Chappaqua, haha. And not under a separate heading in the book by Bolton, but there's a reason for that. It's translated as a separate place. They never signed their own treaties and kept an ambiguous relationship with other Wappinger sachemdoms, but they were Wappingers. Chief Wampus was the Chappaqua sachem. He was named after Wampus Pond. Again, tributary, Mp, Clearwater, and Oos Small. That's where he lived. There were Chappaqua villages at Chappaqua Hills, Newcastle Corners, and at Roaring Brook, South Bank. I just drove by there. So this is a little hilly, actually. In 1696, Newcastle was sold by Coharnus, was I think also called Cornelius, something they take the closest English name. Chief Wampus was several others. So this is the local tidbit. And again, it's hard to find a lot about some of these places. Now, Toquams originally were in Greenwich, Connecticut, under the Siwanoy, and part of the Wappingers Confederacy, and they moved slowly up this pink area, which sees the Wappingers territory, till they got to Paterson, New Jersey. Toquam meaning a round rock, and again, some people comment, one that looks like a turtle, but there was several different villages at Paterson along Route 22, which was the Tulpehoken Trail. And they were there a long time after that. Nakpim. This is north of the Kitchewan. I just gave a whole hour about the Nakpim a month ago. The wild mountain regions of Putnam and Vanderdonk, who's a very important early Dutch historian. He's there face to face with these people. He's not making this stuff up, Vanderdonk's good. He states firmly that the Nakpim were Wappingers, and they extended from Manitou Mountain, Anthony's Nose, if you wish, along the Hudson, over Breakneck Ridge to the south bank of the Matawan Creek. Now that was counterintuitive for me, but Vanderdonk saw it, and he wrote it down. The Phillips family bought the land directly from the Nakpim. So we have a kind of, in this case, a pretty clear story and this was amended shortly after to include the eastern flank of the county where the Patcham tribal territory were living. They are also Wappingers. So that's, again, so there's this odd no man's land between the top of Breakneck Ridge over to this, what you call Fishkill Creek. And the Wappingers proper, the chieftaincy was, this is again Bolton, was situated in Dutchess County, bearing the tribal name, and exercises some form of control in such matters as war and peace. So that was Bolton at his best, I think. Former county historian Helen Wilkinson Reynolds, who was my predecessor as county historian of Dutchess County, firmly establishes the term Wappingers for native people of Dutchess County. And that just, okay, south of the Sapasco and west of the Wassaic, that's Wappingers. And in her book, she describes in great detail Poughkeepsie, the origins and meanings of the word. I believe it was 1934. Hard to get book, and I'm trying to do some reprints of this book, but I kind of owe her because, you know, I got that name on my name, right? So anyway, it's very detailed, Wappingers. Tenkatagi. Now here's another, speaking of Helen Wilkinson Reynolds, there's another person I owe a lot to is Mike D'Amico, not related, I think, to our D'Amico here, but he said he was the chief of hereditary sachem of the Tenkatagis, and that people pronounce it wrong. People say Tankitikis. He said, that's like Walt Disney. That sounds like Disneyland, and it's not a serious name. The name is Tenkatagis. And he said, tell everybody it's Tenkatagis. And he had gravitas, you know, so he had said it the right way. So I always tell people, always say Tenkatagis. And they were located right between New York and Connecticut. And then they, too, moved gradually north. Houdin, who's one of my favorites, by the way, he only deals with linguistics, but boy, he understood Algonquin. And he said that means people with a forest, but does not break it down solidly. And again, D'Amico claimed to be the sachem and pronounced it Tenkatagis, and he said it means people who live in the woods. Rikgalawank. They are neighbors of the Siwanoy and often did trade with them and sign treaties with them. Bolton thinks they had ties to the people on the west side of the Hudson. He does not offer proof. The initial R implies Wappingers. Definite settlements at Yorkville, Harlem, Washington Heights, Inwood. I sound like a train conductor. Inwood and the island of Kingsbridge, which is now Marble Hill, by the way. Island of Kingsbridge, you hardly hear that term anymore, but now it's all cemented onto Manhattan. Also, Spuyten Duyvil Hill in Yonkers, Keskisik, which means sedge grass, by the way, and Wenatchee, the whole west side of the Bronx, which has to do with a stream. In the peace treaty of 1645, they were represented by the Wecqueesgeeks, which Bolton takes to mean that they were entirely subordinate to this Wappingers nation. In other words, they were Wappingers. In addition, the Grand Chief Sesekemu was a Grand Chieftain, appears as chief of the Requawang. 4 years later, he appeared as chief of the Wecqueesgeeks, and in 64 as chief of the Wappingers, so he got around. Now, Canarsie. Okay, so you have, showing you this map over here. Canarsie, Bolton says they were probable owners of southern Manhattan and Brooklyn and the islands in the harbor, but were they Wappingers? Well, he doesn't really say, but he lists them with Wappingers. The word Canarsie means watershed in Taino. I believe this refers to the East River, which is not a river, nor is it an estuary, but it is a watershed, and it's a basin, right? And this word Canarsie really means a watershed, but it's a basin. So it's not a river, and it's not an estuary, so that's pretty good. The Canarsie lived in their canoes, but occupied land on both sides of the East River, where there were numerous tributaries, all connected by ferry boat routes and services. So I want to show you that blue line goes directly from Brooklyn over to what's now South Street Seaport, or nearby, because that was the bottom, the opening of the Maiden Lane Creek, which offered a kind of a stairway up to the higher lands. Canarsie associated with the Madawack of Long Island. And by the way, Madawack, Metic seems to be related to a Taino word for sunrise, which makes sense on that spot. The Taino and Canarsie connection follows northward. Much of Queens along the East River was under the jurisdiction of the Canarsie chiefs of Old Brooklyn. As we see, there is a strong Taino connection with the Wappingers, which cannot be said of the Munsee and Yanami nations. So the point is that these are two distinct people, the Wappingers and the Muncie, Delaware, they've got great differences. There's unique qualities to both. So I'll have some volunteers want to hold up some of these maps. We have our, how shall I say, the Sisters of Mercy here. So hold up the New York map. So these maps, by the way, are brand new. They were printed today, just a few hours ago. And that's a new map of Lower Manhattan. It was designed for showing at the South Street Seaport Museum, which delayed. Now you get to see it first. But I want to show you this. Is this Canarsie, means watershed. And there's the Muscuda, that's the Algonquin word for the East River. That means there's lots of reeds. But look at this, you have the Canarsie territory on both sides, here and here. And there's actually lots of little tributaries that you can't see anymore because they're under cement. Like here, for example, here, there's lots of Shetmo streams, Rechiwanis Creek, and here, of course, I mentioned this, the Werepose Lake comes here, and Cherry Street is right there, Chatham. And then there's this landing, which is Maiden Lane, and there's South Street Seaport, see. So they lived on both sides, and they're in canoes. And so one of the many things this map shows is that, you know, people are thinking, oh, the Canarsie are only in Brooklyn, and there's this river. Well, no, they were on both sides equally, and it's not a river. It's a watershed that they traveled, and they were the ones to make these ferry routes across from one side to the other. And so that's just some of the things I wanted to, I mean, I could go a lot about this map, but I want to show you a lot of interesting things, as this is, where is it? This is Lapinican River, which is now you call Canal Street, right? And that, you see it cuts across the entire island, so there's actually two Manhattans. And the early Dutch talked about the Manhattans, right, in their writings. And Moby Dick talks about the Manhattans. Everybody knew, and now we forgot. What happened was, I like to call people and say, guess what happened? A giant earthquake split Manhattan in two. And everybody gets excited. I say, well, that was a couple million years ago. But see, here's the evidence. And it's still open. You can't build on this. Everything falls in. And I've taken people on tours, and you know, you see buildings still tilting over. So thank you. You can rest your arms. And then briefly, the other one. So these are, you know, premier showings here. This is really exciting. So I've been working on these for quite a long time, you know. Okay. And Victoria and Stacy, right?
Evelyn.
Evelyn, oh. Evelyn and Victoria. Thank you. Okay, so this is another recent map, and I had a lot of help from native elders on this map in particular because they wanted to get it right. And especially like these little things like these little lines here and here, you know. Well, a lot of discussion went into that. And also the Shinnecock, we're trying to, you know, they were recently federally recognized and trying to establish exactly where the border was between them and the Montauks. And so that's new, a new feature. And also, I almost started a civil war because I forgot to paint this island yellow. But they're right, it's a Shinnecock Island. I should never painted it blue, what was I thinking? So here's the Esopus area where I live and my relatives are Esopus and in-laws. And here's the Tappan. I mentioned that orange color is really the Minisink color. And Minisink Island is over here, very important area. Gave a talk there last week. That's the Tappan, and here's the Raritan I mentioned. And Staten Island is divided into three parts. And again, the Tappan settled that deal. Here's Wappagers, as we've been talking about, and there's connections linguistically to Long Island. This part of Long Island is also Tappan. And again, the green part has connections to Connecticut. And the gray of the Unkachog relates also to the Pequot. And look, Nipmuc is gray, same color, because these actually have very closely related, if not the same, languages related to the Narragansett. And then the Pequot kind of had that word, made everything a little more exciting. And here's the Montauks, also related linguistically. The Wangunk this is important in terms of understanding this language of the Wappagers, because the Wangunk is an old language which has that R in it. And they came here, and what happened is I'm going to show you in a minute. Okay, I think we can put this down now, but there's so much we could talk about. But I want to show you a really exciting thing here. Thank you. Now I'm going to get to this. Could we? I don't know how much time. Okay, Wapping means men of the East, enabling a west bank of the Connecticut River. And I didn't make a slide of this, but here is a map of Massachusetts, and I cut it in half like a sandwich. And here, if you see that little yellow square on the Connecticut River, it says Wapping, and that's their original territory of the Wapping. But there were people already here, and then the Wappings moved here, and then the Taino moved in, you see, so that's inclusive. Now these people near Greenfield, they spoke a Wongunk language, parent to Kuripi, and that's the source of many non-Muncie place names here and personal names. The word Wappingers, or Wappingus, some say, seems to derive from, according to Lewis cast material, from a play on the words with Muhua Pinkus or Opossum, and the word means a person or thing with no fur on its tail. They always go for the unique quality that you know. So that's Muapinkus. So that became Wappingus. And a story stick was found in Wappingers Falls, carved in the forms of an owl on the bottom, a possum in the middle, and a frog on the top. The three stages of Wappingers development historically. And I'll show you that in a minute. I make sure I get there. So other sources. Well, I want to say this, that there are other villages and bands who never made it to the top of their history books by far. Have never been recognized, some of whom may also have been adopted elsewhere. These villages, or you might call them bands of the Wappingers, include the Sapasco, who are mixed Mohican, Wappingers, and Muncie, the Chicomico, who are mostly Mohican, but also Hulan or Highland Wappingers, Delawares, Wampanosh, and Esopus. And the Wampanosh were in Wappinger territory, but that really means the little nation of the Wampanoags, and they ran there after the massacre of Taunton in 1676. There is also a Winaki in West Poughkeepsie. There's still, you'll see streets named Winaki, the whole area of Winaki, that's named after the tribe. Aquanessing in Hyde Park, it means a muddy place of mastodons, this has become Aqua when they moved to New Paltz, So Aquanessing is a tribe of the Wappingers, and mostly would say a village. And Matawan, East Beacon. Patcham Wappingers roamed what's now Beacon all the way over to eastern Putnam County, again, not so far from here, named after a Wappingers chief. There were Mohegan Wappingers in Putnam County and not associated with Uncas tribe of Mohegans or Gladys Tantaquidgeon. Bolton mentioned the Sackhoes of Peekskill as a sub-tribe of the Kitchewan, and they went from sea level to mountaintops in a century's time, and I want you to know a bit about them because I've spent several lovely hours conversing with several of these people of the Sackhoes. They're still here, but they're way up in the mountains. They moved gradually from Peekskill Hollow Road along that trail, along the river, and up into Putnam County. Okay, and there are others who have never been recognized. Well, this is pretty much repeat. They're self-acknowledged with their own communities, and a lot of them never wanted to have ID cards. I found that at the end of the 1800s, however, many Hoogland or Highland Indians really did live on top of mountains, which is pretty unusual for natives, hence the name. This is another, actually repeat, but I want to say that, I'll skip over some of this, customary for Wappingers clans to intermarry with Muncie Delaware clans, hence the sense of connection between the two, but without compromising tribal identity of either group. This may seem strange to European Americans, but it's actually very common, part of the Crow, and with the Crow Nation, and it's a Crow phratry, all children belong to the mother's clan and stayed identified with her their whole lives, and her people. If the mother was Wappingers and the father was Muncie, Delaware, for example, the father would move to the east side of the Hudson, where we are, and help with the family, but without becoming Wappingers. Meanwhile, the children would be Wappingers and look to the mother's brother as an uncle, which would be like a father. The downside of this is when they were adopted into the Oneida tribe as refugees, then the Wappingers men married the Oneida women, and of course they had the same ideas that all the children would become Oneida and not Wappingers, and in fact they were emphatic to make sure that the children knew all about the Oneida and nothing about the Wappingers, and that's just, it wasn't mean, this is how it works. Daniel Ninham, the last Grand Chief of the Wappingers, and he used the word Confederacy, said that both Munsee and Wappingers, relatives in his line, yeah, he was famously Wappingers, right? So is that confusing? This implies that one sheik, his famous ancestor, may not have been his father's father, but maybe a relative of his Wappinger's mother. So, you know, it gets a little complicated, but it actually works if you leave it alone. This is another repeat. So I'm going to say here, okay, the Wappingers in the middle. The Wappingers are mentioned in the Treaty of Easton in 1750, so that's getting pretty far along, which was signed in Pennsylvania, but they were refugees from New York. And in Charles Thompson's notes on that treaty, they were described as river Indians along with Mohican. They were also listed in Lewis Cass's interviews in Detroit, Michigan, published in 1821, where they were listed as Opano or Oppings or Wapping or Opossum. This is according to their own testimonies. And that's published in the Delaware Indian Westward Migration by C.A. Westlager, a very famous author. So in the 1630s, Vanderdonk, who I spoke highly of, he wrote in Dutch, their various tongues may be classed into 4 distinct languages. And this is referring to Manhattan area. In the Hudson Valley, he says 4 distinct languages, namely Manhattan, which we'd call Muncie today, Makwa or Minqua, which we'd call Haudenosaunee or Iroquois, Savanu, which we would call Shawnee, and Wampanoos, which we'd call Wappingers. 4 languages, very distinct. So he's saying that Wappingers' language is not the same as Muncie. And that's true, they're not. Okay, so this, maybe skip over this, but Ruttenberg references the Wappingers being somehow related to the Mohican and the River Indians, but that's also called Delaware. But again, I read a book earlier today where it's an old paper where the guy says that the Delaware were included all the people of New England, New York, and New Jersey. And it's like, no way. But you see how the word Delaware just kind of took off by itself, so you can't trust that word. Now, in the numerous descendants of the Wappingers people living in the Hudson Valley and self-acknowledged, living in plain sight. Now, I also mentioned Loskiel, who's a Moravian, mentions the word in a glossary published in Europe in 1795. So that's very odd. That's the first written account. The first actual quote in Moravian's records was recorded by Benjamin Mortimer, 1796, the last year, I guess, when George Washington was president, and that was in Ohio. So there's all kinds of things. And again, Lenape, it's a good term. It means good men, but it was used first in Ohio as far as I can see. And I'm going to skip over this, but this is going to be very interesting. So this is a spot where arrowheads were found for the Wappingers, clearly Wappingers. It's Grinnell Estate and Wappingers Falls. And look at this. This is a story stick that was dug up somewhere. Algonquin for clans is totem, but was found in Wappingers Falls. It is between 150 and 400 years old, but its carver, whoever carved it, knew a whole lot about Wappingers traditions. It shows an owl at the bottom, an opossum in the middle, and a frog at the top. Can you see that? So here's the, this is my interpretation. Immediately when they handed me the stick, I said, I know what this is. This is amazing. The messenger or assistant to a chief in Mohican culture is called an owl, or a doodah in Mohican. This owl symbolizes the ancient Mohican phase of the Wappingers culture. Note the spotted wings and legs. Proto-Mohican was a root language for many Algonquin languages, including the Wappingers tongue. So what I accidentally left out was there's a Madison point that matches this, this particular face, and it's a very classical arrowhead which you've seen in Boy Scout camps. And wood, there's a wood. Anyway, I'll go back to it. So the possum is in the middle. Can you see his long pointed nose? And you see that his marsupial pouch is right under his hands, and it's a possum. Okay. Long-toed feet. You see the claws in his feet, just like a possum? It symbolizes the Wappingers or Wampanoag society, men of the East, who came from the Connecticut River, calling themselves Wappings. Some were still in Greenfield, Mass. In the 1600s and 1660s. The word is related to Muhuapinkus or possum. Wappinger speech had a distinctive R, which comes from the Matabesic people, or those Wangungs, the same thing, Connecticut River Valley, which are later expressions of that shamanic culture called Wagung. It was very old. So what I think happened is they called themselves Wappings, men of the East, and then when we came here, there's this wordplay going on all the time. Say, Wapping, haha, you're possums. And that became part of the Wappingers culture. But then, look at this. The frog at the top symbolizes recent arrivals, the Taino, whose famous national symbol is the coqui, or frog, who were adopted into the Wappingers in 1300, according to state archaeologist William Ritchie, who just described this without using the word Taino. Proto-Taino traders have been coming up the Atlantic current from Puerto Rico since 1000 BC, and you think, how do I know that? Well, Mel Johnson, who was a historian, very famous historian who passed away, he brought me there and he said, you know, there's this mound that's still there at Plum Point. And he says, when I was young, they took me here, and this Dr. Carhart from Oxford came and said, we're going to dig here. And all the students dug. And then they dug down to ground level, and they found the usual artifacts. And then all this is really cool. And Carhart said, now we're going to dig much deeper, and you'll be surprised what we find. So we went down into the earth, very far into the earth, and they dug up a statue of a jaguar. And he said, this jaguar was carved by the Taino in 1000 BC. And so I went to the Mohicans. I said, what the heck, you know? Did you know about this? He said, oh yeah, I know, I didn't want to tell you, but you know, it's upset people. But we traded with them to establish that wonderful trade. And you see what happens is there's an Atlantic trade current caused by a vent that's at the base of San Juan, Puerto Rico, and it creates this very fast stream of water all the way up to the New York Harbor, and they just get in that stream, only the problem is it's one way. So they have to stay in and move in. And that's a very long story made very short. But this stick immediately recognized the coqui. And they like it to have this is very, you know, distinct sound, right? And it only grows in Puerto Rico, Puerto Rico. So I'm going to skip all this in case, again, all you other people watching in film can slow this down, but I've translated every single place name in Westchester County. And let's see, again, you see Chappaqua, a separate place within the Wapingers Confederacies. So we said that. Now, Konongung Hill, by the way, Konongung, it means river crossing, and it's a Quinnipiac village on the Bronx River. See, they were coming over. But the origin, I believe, is from Gun Hill. Gun Hill is from this word, but then there's this crazy story about this British general who fired a cannon from that spot, and I don't know, I don't believe it. So here's many of these. So, sprain is an old Dutch word to spread seeds by hand, from sprain to spread, spreiden, but also, you know, there's a number of sprains. So I can't go through all these. They're all very interesting. Amina means oysters. Again, Neperham, Fish Trap Creek. Paramac means sprain brook, the word for sprain brook, likely cod or possibly eel. Anyway, we can look at these later. Pawcatuck was the name of the Peekskill Hollow Road, and it goes up the Pawcatuck River, the Pawcatuck Trail, Peekskill Hollow. Okay, so I'll tell you about Sinasqua. I was traveling with a friend, and we got to Croton Point, and I said, say, is there a giant rock here that's made entirely out of clamshells that's right next to some really shallow water? He said, yeah, how'd you know? Are you psychic? I said, no, there's a giant sign right there that's telling me that. Sinasqua. It pays to know Algonquin. So Sacos means where the water flows out. There's so many of these translations here, but again, on the film we can look at them, and there's all these others. So let's say all these, we translated every one of them. So the 7 great rivers that are all interconnected by portages: Hudson River, Wequeesgeek, Sawmill, Sprain Brook, Bronx River, Sheldrake, Mamaroneck, and the Hutchinson. So the Hutchinson was called the Aquiononk. Let me go through these. Hudson River, of course, Mahikanituk. That is the river that flows both ways. Mo means the greatest of all. Hikan is an arm of the sea or an estuary. So it's the river, the greatest of all estuaries you ever saw, and flows both ways. Wickers Creek is from Wequeesgeek, which I translate as the head of a shallow water in a prominent place. Sawmill was Neperhan, means fish trapping place. Paramac was Sprain Brook, and that's eels. Aquahung means steep banks. Sheldrake, I don't have a name for. And the Merrimack was Paketaswaki. And that's like treasure yourself. No, it means flat place of land. And Aquyanunk is Hutchinson. So, just showing you where the Wapims come from. So there's this Quoropus city, which again turned out pretty good, I guess. And you've seen that. And there's the battle that was there because of the portage. That has something to do. And here's some pictures. I'm just going to run through some pictures of these wonderful places where you could be canoeing right now. Bronx River at a very shallow spot, which we need to discuss as to they can open those sluices and have the water get deeper, which they do actually on holidays. They open those reservoir dams sluices on holidays so you can canoe better. And here's a waterfall, but there's a walk around. The common path, Tulpehoken Trail, now Route 22, also known as the Post Road. 22. Sheldrake Creek is very shallow, but a very important link in the chain. This is Ashburton to Dobbs Ferry. We come to this Brain Brook. There's the source of this Brain Brook. Still can almost get a tiny canoe in there. And this is a portage used by George Washington at the Battle of White Plains. And this is a sawmill. It's still quite canoeable sawmill. It's really ideal. This is a sawmill at its best. You can imagine just sailing along in a canoe. And this is the sawmill or Nepperhan. Ends up in Yonkers, going out to the Hudson River, just at the train station where the statue of Ella Fitzgerald marks the spot. And after I wrote about it, the sawmill was daylighted, because I kind of jokingly suggested they should rip up all that cement and so we can see the sawmill, the Nepperhan, and then they did. But only as far as Chicken Island. Anybody ever been to Chicken Island? Yeah, Chicken Island. Well, that was the crossing place of this Sawmill River, because you always cross at an island and you meet on the island, and so people would meet on Chicken Island. And then it's all covered over now with stores and stuff. And again, Dobbs Ferry Road was the great portage sawmill. Flood control, Wickers Creek. Now here's Wickers Creek going upstream. What they did was they built a fishing weir here at the highest point so the fish would go past it, and then when the water came out again, they'd be trapped in the wicker. And there's some pictures of the kind of wicker fish traps that the natives built. And again, that's even further up on the right. So anyway, lots to say here. And so again, another book, John Hooden's, again, the Hague Museum, but this is the book called Indian Place Names of New England. But in fact, what we're learning is that there's a lot of overlap between here and New England through these different layers of culture. So that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. How's that? Thank you. Okay.
Wait, I'm kidding.
I don't know your name.
It's all right. Maxine, how are you?
Hi.
So it gives me a whole new perspective of Chappaqua. One of the meanings, the meaning you have means a separate place, because now everything's coming clear. But anyway, there's no chief and no representation, you said. And the Native Americans always say, well, a lot that I've heard of late in learning about Buttonhook Forest and people who, Native Americans who were there, that they never owned the land. No one owns the land, it's borrowed. And we didn't have representation, and we didn't have a chief. So how did this land get transferred? And who would even, was it legal? I mean, at the time, how did this all happen in terms of, whoever was here, the Dutch were getting the land, and since this is separate and no representation, I'm just curious how that works.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know if anybody's resolved that, but there's various levels of coercion involved, but some of which is not necessarily deadly or lethal, but people say was unceded. People like to say it was unceded land when they do the acknowledgments, but really they were given, in some cases, quite a bit of material goods and wampum and supplies and whatnot in exchange for land, but also in many, many of the cases, I don't know the percentage, but they also retained fishing right and also eagle feather rights. And that was important. You see that in some of the treaties for Brooklyn and up here, is that people were doing these deals and whatever, selling land, but they would retain the right to gather feathers from the bottom of a certain tree and to fish and to hunt. And, so there are those that are still claiming those. But your questions are good. It's not really so clear. But the thing is that the idea was that no one owns land, but that you can have a peace treaty with people sharing the land, and the treaty says that you will not argue and not battle with them, that you'll be peaceful sharing the land. And that's definitely within the tradition, because they had boundaries. They really did have a sense of belonging to just certain places, and they had boundaries. And people may say otherwise, but they did. And especially during the colonial period, because it became clear that they had to do something. And plus, in the 1600s, when you're talking about the era I was describing, there's all these land deals. But in fact, those Wappingers people were in a lot of trouble. They were losing their people to disease, decimated by disease. They were losing in battles. I came across some dreary statistics recently on how many Wappingers died on any particular day, but it was scattered around. I thought, you don't want to hear that, it's really dreary. But they died off for various reasons fairly quickly, and they didn't have enough people at a certain point to tend the land, to take good care of it. And they had all these relatives to the west, because again, we talk about they had a certain phratry intermarriage with the Munsee to the west. And the Munsee territory, as you see from this map over here, you see the green and the blue in the left map, that's the Catskills. That's a lot of land, and those were their relatives, the Minisink and the Esopus Munsee. And they could move in. So it was like, was it worth it? All this, terrible neighbors, right? They were having conflicts with the Dutch. And then the Kieft War, Kieft had various, Governor Kieft of New York, the New Amsterdam, was committing, massacres. So it's a very good question, and just saying, I know that they had these land sharing treaties, but they were probably fooled by the Dutch in some cases, who were good businessmen. That's all I can say.
But then the Quakers came in.
And
And they're supposed to be more peaceful, not as the Dutch were.
certainly not about land,
Right.
and not as warlike, like the Puritans. But I've heard some great stories about Quaker and Algonquin relations that encouraged the idea that they got along pretty well. And there were some intermarriages with Quakers. And you see even the map of Manhattan, there was a certain settlement that became, Ossitok Village, I think, became the famous Quaker house in Manhattan. So yeah, there's a lot to go on. There's clues, putting the pieces together, right? Good question. Okay, that's Victoria.
So first of all, thank you. This is just incredibly fascinating and so helpful and so interesting to kind of see where we are and all the different connections, and especially as we work on the Buttonhook Forest quest to try to save and preserve that land and the sacred space there. We have met a number of different folks from different tribal heritages or histories. And the Wappinger question, like you talk so much about Wappinger, and I guess I'm just trying to, I'm very visual, so I'm trying, and I love the maps. I'm trying to understand the Confederacy aspect. In other words, if you think about, is it under the umbrella of, so to speak, of the Wappinger, and then there are a number of different sub-tribes that are part of it? I'm just trying to understand how the Confederacy operated, and then also how it exists now. In other words, what is your understanding of the folks who are still here from the Wappinger lineage? And is there anything that still resembles that Confederacy, and in terms of leadership of the Wappinger? It's so fascinating, the lack of ego and how inclusive they were. I'm just wondering if you could also give us a sense of where that is now and how you perceive that.
Yeah, make me want to cry. One of the most tragic stories and national histories in the world is the Wappinger. So it's all sad. And I've met a lot of Wappingers people because I write about them. They come to me and they generally say, okay, I'll tell you this. And people are right, you know, they hide out. And I'll tell you a Muncie story quickly, and I was giving a talk in Ellenville, and it was on Native New Yorkers. This is when the book first came out, and then there was all these Native American women that looked like they stepped off, you know, a reservation in Arizona, you know, with the full regalia, and the features were very striking. I said, hi, where you all come from? Are you from out west? They said, yes, we're from out west. And I said, well, how far out west? How about 3 miles? But the Wappingers are the same thing. And in East Beacon, for example, and in Chatham, Glenham, for example, which on the map, the old maps, that was a big native town. And, you know, I went years trying to find Mattawan Indians and never found a single peep. And then I met this young lady who said she was Mattawan, and I started to ask questions, and she says, oh, and let me introduce you, my family, there's all these relatives everywhere. And they all were her relatives, meaning if she's telling the truth, then they're all related to the Mattawan. And they had all these different, you know, ways. And one thing that happened, there was this gentleman whose name was Chubby, or Tubby, I guess his name was Tubby. And he decided that, you know, he was like, he loved his people, he wanted the culture to continue. And so he got a job with the railroad. He wasn't really well educated, but, you know, he got a job and he worked his way up through the railroad, Metro North, and made some money, and he just built houses for people, and, you know, all together. And a lot of them were on top of a mountain, Mount Beacon. And in 1900, you know, the state came in and bulldozed the whole thing down, and, you know, and they were tenacious. And she showed me the houses they all lived in. And it's traditional for 3 generations to live together, which is, I guess, pretty universal, because, you know, the young, ambitious culture, they've got couple, I mean, they have the kids, and then the kids are the early generation, the parents are the middle, and then grandma and grandpa, of course, the early ones taking care of the kids. So there's 3 generations, and they showed me houses, there's like 3 levels of houses. What do you call it, a 3-story house, where, you know, they all lived together doing it that way. And so there's all these things, and I could tell you a million stories, and they're really wonderful stories about how the Wappinger people would kind of, you know, let me know, right? And I was at I was running a poetry seminar. There's 100 people, 100 poets, and they're all over. And big room, and across the room, bigger than this, the back door, the door opened, and this woman walked through. And I said, that woman's Wappingers. I'm going to talk to her. So I pushed through the whole crowd and went over to her. And her mother's like, are you some kind of masher? Leave off my daughter. I said, no, she's Wappingers. That's why I want to talk to her. And the woman was like, what are you talking about? You're crazy. I'm not Wappingers. And then her mother grabbed her and said, daughter, there's something we have to talk about. And it turns out the family had considerable records of their, you know, Wappingers connections. Okay, I mean, I can tell you so many stories. And I was camping with a friend who was Wappingers, and in the tent, we opened the little door, and she says, Chabungis. I said, what did you just say? She says, Chabungis. I said, you know, no one said that in this territory for 400 years? You know what it means? She said, yeah, that's what you say when it's like later than you thought. And you say it's like, you know, great getting up day in the morning, like the song, right? It says, yeah, but that's Wappingers, that's Algonquin. And like, are you, you know? And it's like, well, no, everybody says that. I said, no, nobody says that. Who says that? So, oh, my father, my brother, my uncle, they all say it. My grandfather, they all say it. Everybody says it. I said, but it's all your relatives, and they're all like Wappingers, you know. Anyway, so I could tell you so many stories. It's all this secret society. They're very, 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 very secretive. Okay, so none of them. I didn't even ask these people to come, but you know, I'm speaking up, you know, positively for them that they really are a real group, but they don't have ID cards. And I asked the person 2 days ago, I said, would you ever carry an ID card? He said, no way. People are people. I mean, we're who we are, but, you know, everyone's a person, and we don't want to carry cards, you know. And so that's why I'm telling you this whole story of the last hour, is this is why they don't carry cards, because they know who they are, and they know who they're related to, and they don't want to be objectified into categories by race, which is racist, and it's like apartheid. So that's my message, is that let's let people, And let's all be friends. And you have a hand up here. Let's be the last one, I think, right?
Okay, that'd be the last one, Chris.
The Wappingers are U.S. citizens, absolutely. Yes, the Wappingers are citizens. No, they're citizens. They don't have to be recognized. The Wappingers vote. Right. Whereas some tribes are recognized as separate sovereign tribes and they don't vote, and some do. You know, there's all these variations. But there's plenty.
Tribes, are they citizens?
Who?
The separate citizen tribes, are they citizens?
Well, the Shinnecock, for example, fought this whole idea of citizenship. They wanted to be sovereign, right? And then it all had to do with, you know, World War II, and they were trying to sign them up. But then what happened was they worked that out, and then a large number of them voluntarily signed up to fight in World War II for the United States after winning their sovereignty. So that became a matter of free choice. So that's, I mean, every tribe's going to have a different story on that. But the Wappingers vote because they have never been recognized by the U.S. as anything but United States citizens. Okay. Some, by the way, joined the Mohicans, or they moved to Stockbridge, became Stockbridge, Muncie, or they became Stockbridge, Muncie, Band of Mohicans, and then they went with the Mohicans. In order to get that federal recognition, they went through a lot of a horrible time period in the 1820s and 40s, trying to get to Wisconsin, where they would have their own land and then become recognized and therefore a sovereign recognized tribe. Each story is different. Some of the Wappingers went with them, that's for sure. Some of them joined George Washington. By the way, you ever heard of Daniel Nimham? Daniel Nimham, Chief Daniel Nimham? Huh? Sachem.
They dedicated the statue.
The statue. Well, let me tell you a story about him. About that, you know, he died in Cortlandt Ridge. And he was going through, he was guarding this Cortlandt Ridge area, and the head of the British general who came through for the dragoons, you know, he was on his horse, and Ninham jumped on the back of his horse and pulled that very famous general off of his horse, and they did hand-to-hand combat. And Ninham was a famous Grand Chief and captain in George Washington's army. And here was the head of the dragoons. It's very rare for two, as you probably know, two top military figures to go into hand-to-hand combat. It never happens. But here it happened, and his orderly, Simcoe was the name of the general, and his orderly showed up and shot Ninham straight in the head. And he didn't die right away, but he said, "Let me as an old tree die here." And then he eventually died. Okay, but what's interesting is that there's a very plausible theory that he knew that George Washington was 6 miles away at White Plains in secret, at White Plains, because we know that because George Washington wrote 6 letters to his general that day. So we know exactly where he was. Ninham was 6 miles away, keeping the head of the dragoons off of his trail. So he died to save George Washington, I think. Now, not everybody knows that, but that's a plausible theory as to why Ninham, a high captain and a grand sachem, was doing this, was like jumping on the back of Simcoe's horse. Well, it turns out, interesting by the way, just our idea is there's no all good, not one person evil and the other good, but what happened was Simcoe, after the war, became the governor of Ottawa and became, no, not Ottawa, but Toronto. And he declared that whole Ontario as a free space for free of slavery. So this is one of the first places in North America to be free of slavery. And of course, guess what? Lots of slaves in the U.S. wanted to go there really fast. And that's where you have followed the drinking gourd. What does that mean? The drinking gourd's in the north. So you follow the drinking gourd, or the Great Bear, chokes me up, and Harriet Tubman, who should be on the 20, okay, took everybody up there following the drinking gourd to Toronto and other areas where they would be free of slavery. And that Simcoe had a part in that. That was his decision. And then he was so popular as this kind of, you know, everybody's friend, even though he killed Ninham, that he made him Viceroy of India. And then on the way to India, he got cholera and died on the ship, never made it. So we never know what would have happened. But I mean, you could speculate all day. What if he hadn't killed Ninum? Ninum would have been some great civil rights hero himself, because that's where he rolled. But also, what if he had gotten to India, then Gandhi wouldn't have had so much to fix, and then he wouldn't have been, I mean, you know, it goes on. Anyway, that's a nice positive note to stop on. And so I thank you for your question.